Hi everyone, and welcome to the second unplanned audio recording of a lecture for Geography 324. I want to start by just saying thanks for your understanding. I know that this isn't optimal. However, I'm feeling unwell and I made the difficult decision to stay home and heed the recommendations of the BC Provincial Officer of Public Health in social distancing and staying home when you're feeling unwell. I want to encourage all of you that Trevor and I have been in discussion about possibilities for this course should the risk level change for COVID-19. We're following the protocols that are set in place by SFU and also the province. And I just want to assure everyone that no matter what happens, we remain really flexible in ensuring that we can make the most of your experience in this course, especially for the remaining weeks. And we are open to your suggestions, and we'll be checking in with you frequently and staying on top of things for you. So thanks again for listening as we go through the topics and material for this week on the intersectional geographies of transportation. So once again, I want to begin by sharing with you the big idea for this week. This big idea is what you can use to orient the rest of the content that you're going to be hearing about. It's a baseline that you can use to inform your understanding and comprehension of the readings. And you can use it as a way to begin making the types of connections that we're looking for you to be making in discussion while you're in tutorial. So the question is, what is the relevance of intersectional dynamics in urban transportation? Now, at this point, the word intersectional or the term intersectionality might not mean a lot to you. So a big part of this lecture is going to be covering what intersectionality is and isn't. I'm going to be showing you some new terms and giving you some examples about how we put all this together in order to attempt a response to this question of how relevant an intersectional analysis or intersectional dynamics are for understanding urban transportation. So this is just a brief outline of what's to come. I'll be introducing to you the terms intersectionality and mobilities, grounding them in the academic literature, providing some examples, and then we're going to move to why all this matters. So in that section, we will be bringing together these two new terms of intersectionality and mobilities, and I'll be providing some more examples of why this matters and how this maybe attenuates or changes what we choose to focus on when studying urban transportation, but also how these terms our reality and how we experience urban transportation. And I'll be looking at this from a supply side and also a demand side of urban transportation, particularly urban public transportation. So that's what you have coming up. So the term of the day is intersectionality. Some of you may have encountered this term before in class. Some of you may have encountered this term in pop culture. It's really, beginning in 2017, saw a spike in use and also misuse, which we'll get to, in popular media and popular literature. And some of you may have not perhaps heard of the term intersectionality before, but nonetheless have experiences that can be sort of explained by or illuminated by the term intersectionality. So even though you might not have had the term before, your experiences with intersectionality may provide a lot of evidence to you about what this term means and how it operates systemically, and also how it operates at the level of the individual. So, although it didn't necessarily start out this way in the literature, it's turned out to be quite contentious. And there are three separate debates sort of occurring around what it is and how it's used. So the first debate is based on what academics actually mean by the term. So I'm going to talk to you about its academic lineage and where it originated, who it originated from, and just try and give you a good grounding in sort of what it was originally intended for and how it was originally used in the realm of legal studies. So there's debates going on in academia about what is the proper way to use this term intersectional when you're publishing papers or doing research. The second debate that's occurring is based on how activists seeking to eliminate disparities between groups have interpreted the term. All right, so this has to do is basically how we sort of make this term intersectionality actionable. So once we understand what intersectionality is and how it operates systemically, activist groups have different ideas about what it means to navigate, include, perhaps resist intersectionality as it is lived out and acted upon in organizing. And the third debate revolves around how some conservative commentators have responded to the term intersectionality, not necessarily in the literature, because it's quite evident from sort of the pop culture critiques of the term. It's quite evident that those, who are more critical or questioning of the term haven't actually read or understood how it's used in the literature. And this debate is mostly a reaction to that second debate in terms of how intersectionality is made actionable and how it plays out in organizing, in rhetoric, and in how equity-seeking groups are really trying to present their case and push back against the interlocking intersectional systems of discrimination or advantage, mostly discrimination. So intersectionality operates as both the observance and analysis of power imbalances, and it's also the tool by which those power imbalances could be eliminated altogether. So the observance of power imbalances, as is often true, is far less controversial than the tool that could be used to eliminate them. So as the text on the slide reads, intersectionality is the interconnected nature of social categorizations such as race, class, and gender as they apply to a given individual or group, regarded as creating overlapping and interdependent systems of discrimination and advantage. And there's just a few quick things that I want to sort of take a bit more time on when it comes to this definition. The first is, of course, that the social categorizations listed here, being race, class, and gender, are by no means exhaustive. There are times more social categorizations that could be listed here, and I just want to highlight that although race, class, and gender are sort of the golden trio of social categorizations that are often used and referred to, there are many other ways of socially categorizing individuals that do play into this idea of intersectionality. So, for example, religion, sexual orientation, different ways of identifying oneself could be a part of this. And just because they're not here doesn't mean they're any less important. Again, this is perhaps just the pattern that academics have fallen into of always talking about race, class, and gender, and not being super inclusive of other categories. The second thing that I want to point out is that this term intersectionality complements really well the thinking and discussion that you've been doing in this course around systems and systems thinking. So I think that, reminding yourselves or sort of reviewing the lesson I gave on systems thinking, reviewing sort of how systems thinking contributed to the design of your transportation game. This way of framing social categorization and this way of trying to understand systems of discrimination and advantage really benefit from a systems thinking approach. So Kimberly Crenshaw, who I'll introduce you to in just a few moments, was really ahead of the curve when it came to ways of seeing problems, understanding problems, and framing problems within systems. So within these systems of discrimination and advantage, intersectionality is essentially saying that the different ways that individuals identify can overlap and become interdependent. And that has an impact on how the individuals experience discrimination and advantage, and that it's really important that we pay attention to not just one aspect of a person, not sort of reducing a person to one sort of essential identity, but it's important also that we understand how these different categorizations of social identity overlap, and how an individual can face differing sets of circumstances within a system depending on how those individual identities are overlapping and intersect. And what better way to demonstrate this with a visual than in a geography of transportation class than to share with you this image of an intersection. So we can see here that there are sort of guidelines of the system set up in terms of the spatial imprint that we've been talking about of transportation. So there are lanes, there are signals, and there's a system in place that dictates how sort of the individual pieces of the system navigate and work through what's existing. And there could be potential for overlap, for interconnectivity, and depending on what lane you're in, your direction is sort of dictated in a particular way. So what happens when those lanes aren't perhaps as straightforward as the system sets them out to be? All right. So what if a person isn't just a gender or isn't just one race? What happens when there's multiple social categorizations working at once? How does that impact how the system works and responds? And how does that impact how the individual works through that system? Do they have to choose just one way of being? These are the types of questions that an intersectional analysis and intersectional thinking pose to us. So this is Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw, from whom the term intersectionality traces its lineage to. Dr. Crenshaw is a legal scholar, and in the 1980s she was doing research into case law in the United States. And this research led her to discover that the courts had a decidedly one-dimensional understanding of what was understood as a protected category, particularly when it came to job discrimination. So when people were bringing their cases against certain employment firms or employers for job discrimination, they essentially had to pick a lane. So most judgments considered sex and sex alone. And remember in the 1980s, the difference between biological sex and socially constructed gender, the difference between sex and gender was only really beginning to stir in popular culture at the time in the 1980s. So now we would more likely use the term gender discrimination when we talk about job discrimination and gender identity. So as I was saying, most judgments considered either sex and sex alone, or race and race alone. So essentially, you could sue a company for gender discrimination or race discrimination, but not both. Okay, so there was no overlap or intersection of those two categories when it came to people who might have been passed over for a job, might have been let go or fired from a job. The recourse for finding justice in those cases necessitated that individuals pick a lane. They could either sue for gender discrimination or race discrimination. But if you or an individual whose identity intersects with those two things, and Dr. Crenshaw was particularly looking at the experiences of Black women in the workplace, there wasn't a lot of legal recourse available to them at the time. And as the quote here mentions, Dr. Crenshaw used the term intersectionality as, quote, a prism to bring to light dynamics within discrimination law that weren't being appreciated by the courts. So she introduced the term intersectionality as a lens. And when we put on this lens of intersectionality, it really helps us to understand sort of the places in the law, because that's what she was studying, she's a legal scholar, places in the law that didn't account for these intersections or overlapping identities. So while that is how she used it in research, it was also used as a way to critique mainstream feminist thought of the time. And mainstream feminist thought was mostly a white feminist thought. It wasn't an inclusive movement at the time for equal rights. So there was different types of activism occurring, but under the mainstream movement of feminism in the 1980s, it left a lot of groups out. Groups that didn't just identify as women. Groups who maybe identified that way and also identified using other social categories. So it was really, intersectionality was introduced by Kimberly Crenshaw as a way of pointing the finger at feminism of the time and saying, this movement needs to be for all women, not just one particular slice or segment of women, and that the cause of feminism isn't and can't be advanced if it's only doing so in a one-dimensional way. Crenshaw pointed out that because, and I quote, the intersectional experience is greater than the sum of racism and sexism, any analysis that does not take intersectionality into account cannot sufficiently address the particular manner in which Black women are subordinated, end quote. So basically she's saying that the tools and the lenses and the law in the 1980s that she had studied was entirely insufficient to bring about justice for the women and the discrimination that they experienced. So a perfect example of Dr. Crenshaw's essay, Mapping the Margins, is where she talks about the lawsuits where women had to choose. They had to choose whether they identified as Black or whether they identified as female when they were going in for their discrimination employment tribunals. And they were really raising their voices and saying, no, it's different. It's not just that we're Black or just that we're female. It's the unique experience of being a Black woman that brings about the set of circumstances that we're now facing. So, yeah, I just really want to highlight and applaud the work of Dr. Crenshaw. At the time, in 1989, I think, was when she first published the paper, and then it came out in another bigger journal in 1990. But Dr. Crenshaw has been doing this work for decades now, and she continues to conduct important research. She continues to be a leader in activism. and really has become a public figure, and rightfully so, in introducing different ways of thinking about oppression and discrimination and identity, and how those things operate in the world that we live in. So this is just a quick 30-second clip of Dr. Crenshaw explaining what intersectionality is in her own words.
Intersectionality is just a metaphor for understanding the ways that multiple forms of inequality or disadvantage sometimes compound themselves, and they create obstacles that often are not understood within conventional ways of thinking about anti-racism or feminism or whatever social justice advocacy structures we have. Intersectionality isn't so much a grand theory, it's a prism for understanding certain kinds of problems.
And if you haven't seen Dr. Crenshaw's TED Talk, which is entitled The Urgency of Intersectionality, strongly recommend checking in there and watching it. It's about 19 minutes long, and she gives some really excellent examples of how intersectionality sort of operates and takes place. So intersectionality in its simplest form describes how race, class, gender, and other individual characteristics intersect with one another. Bringing an intersectional lens to urban transportation is going to allow us to focus on the specificity of experiences and also the areas that are invisibilized or not extended to in transportation planning and policy. So when we move beyond sort of the usual suspects of binaries or categories of individuals, we're able to produce new types of urban knowledge so that those individuals who aren't usually subsumed or a part of those traditional or de facto categories might be able to navigate the city safely, more safely, affordably, and efficiently. And bringing an intersectional lens is also of particular importance when we're studying transportation equity and when we're studying the unequal distribution of burdens associated with transportation systems in local contexts. So an intersectional lens brought into urban transportation gives us a tool or a prism, as Dr. Crenshaw says, to have a robust conversation about transportation equity and justice and intersectional distributions of both the benefits and the burdens of those transportation systems, both in how then, the built form and the infrastructure, but also the types of social relations that they produce or that take place there. It's unfortunately sometimes the case that when an academic term, which might be really robust and illuminating in the literature, gets picked up by popular culture, it can suffer from a pattern of misuse. It's really a misappropriation of the term. So this is the third debate that I was telling you about a few slides ago. So I just want to have a list here of what intersectionality is not. So these are sadly common ways that it's used online or in speeches on campus. And this is just a list of ways that no one should be using or understanding intersectionality. So it's not just a plea or a cry for special treatment. It's not any kind of conspiracy theory. It's not attempting to create a new hierarchy of race. And less insidious, I think intersectionality is sometimes misunderstood as a simple layering of identity. So this is something that I've had to say to colleagues in the past and people who are maybe newer to gender studies or new to the term intersectionality. It's not just a layering of identity. It's not just a layer cake of different things about you, but it is particularly the intersections of where those identities cross and meet one another, and in some cases sort of subsume one another or bigger parts of one another. And it's really a way of understanding social situations and the types of barriers that people face as a direct result of this intersection of identity, not just a simple layering. So it's really important when you're trying to imagine or visualize intersectionality that you get this layer cake out of your mind. Now, of course, as soon as I tell you, don't think of a cake, what's the first thing you're going to think of? Probably a cake. So I'll show you this graphic so you can replace it in your head, the image of the cake. And we can see here some different pieces of identity. Again, some are larger than others. So some things might be more important to an individual than others, or might be more visible than others. And we can see where these circles are overlapping. And it's not just overlapping between two, sometimes there's multiple points of overlap or intersection. So to give you an example, let's go with this understanding that an intersectional approach assumes that individuals' experiences and choices can shift and change, and that depends on the complicated and constantly changing relationship between these individual characteristics, but also the collective of characteristics that we see here. And they change in response to power relationships that are within social structures. So intersectionality simply tells us that individuals can be simultaneously advantaged and also disadvantaged, depending on the relationships between these different markers. So depending on where sort of these bubbles of identity are and where they're overlapping with one another, it's going to shape the experience of individuals as they go about their lives. So for example, a woman with disabilities who describes herself as bisexual may benefit from being with other women with disabilities, so she might feel a sense of inclusion in that group. But at the same time that she's there and present with that group, she might also feel excluded because other members of the group maybe are making homophobic remarks or jokes about her. So we can see that, it's not simple, it's complicated. And just because you identify with a group or are marked as, seen to be as part of one group, doesn't mean that that space is necessarily going to be safe or wholly inclusive. And this is where an intersectional lens helps us understand the nuance of experiencing the social world or facing different barriers. All right, so that was a description, definition, and some examples of intersectionality, and we're now going to move on to mobilities. So now we're going to move on to the term mobility. Cresswell describes mobility as the fragile entanglement of physical movement, the social shared meanings ascribed to such movement, and the experience and embodied practice of movement. Mobility really comes down to how, when, and under what conditions people, goods, and services move through space. Scheller and Urey, who you might remember reading in week 2, were the geographers partly responsible for beginning what is now called the mobilities turn in human geography literature. Their piece began a wider scholarly conversation about how mobilities is endemic to life, society, and space. Mobility, then, was elevated to a core geographic concept to which space, place, network, scale, and territory also belong. So I wouldn't be surprised if a few of you have come across this before. Mobility and identity are inseparable. How, when, where, why, and what's encountered as people move through space has an influence on us in profound and also in subtle ways. The concept of mobilities encompasses both large-scale movements of people, objects, capital, and information across the world, but it also can be attributed and used to explain more local processes of daily transportation, movement through public space, and also the travel of material things just within everyday life. So this issue of movement, moving through space, the social and shared meanings of that movement, and how that movement is experienced and also embodied is of central concern here. We usually pay attention to mobility when there's too much or when there's too little, or when it's the wrong sort of movement and mobility at the wrong time. So I want to talk to you a bit more about this mobility's turn, as it's called. So transportation geographers, and those studying the geography of transportation, as we are, have traditionally been interested in how often movement happens, at what speeds, where that movement happens, and more recently, who moves. This mobility's turn in academia has led transportation geographers to understand what mobility means and what that mobility represents at the individual or societal level, and how that mobility is actually embodied in practice. Transportation research has by and large failed to illuminate two of the three pillars under this conceptualization, and examining how often movement happens, at what speeds, and also who moves. Transportation researchers are really trying to identify how they can make a difference. And they're perhaps not so good at telling us about what the representations and meanings of mobility, either at the individual level or the social level, is embodied and practiced. So this mobility's turn leads those who are studying the geography of transportation to focus less on the mechanics of movement, but really try and dig a little bit deeper and try and, rather than just explaining how things move, try and understand what that movement represents and document how it is experienced. So sometimes mobility is uneven. And by that I mean that there's differential access or terrain or pathways or connectivity to mobility for some individuals. So uneven mobility can refer to built environments. It can refer to the ways that urban space is splintered and maybe disconnected. Some spaces are disconnected from others. Again, thinking back to our discussion of urban form and spatial imprint. Uneven mobility can also refer to means or modes of movement that have a greater or lesser degree of ease, comfort, flexibility, and safety. So thinking about the different modes of transportation in cities, we know that some modes are easier and more efficient to take than others. But usually that level of efficiency and ease has different types of barriers of access. This suggests a kind of segregated transportation system in that it's splintered. There are explicit rules about who can ride different modes. For example, if you want to ride on public transportation, you have to have some sort of pass or ticket. There are also class-based exclusions that relegate the poor to more dangerous and uncomfortable means of transport, longer distance commutes, peripheral living spaces, and perhaps even homelessness. Thirdly, when it comes to uneven mobility, we're talking again about spatial patterns, about forms of mobility management, the architectures of control that govern the relations of mobility, of speed and slowness. We're talking about surveillance and policing mechanisms to control that movement. And fourthly, uneven mobility refers to local, regional, urban, but also national and global systems that control space, territory, communication, speed. All these different ways to control and manipulate and exert power over the mobility of individuals and the ability of individuals to move through space. And these arguments and definitions of uneven mobility were written by Mimi Scheller. And I'll put, you'll see the citation at the bottom of the slide there. So now it's time to try and put this all together in the context of the geography of transportation. So why does it matter? Why does an understanding of intersectionality and why a critical understanding of mobilities matter for our understanding and how we approach researching and studying urban transportation? So I'm going to address this from two perspectives. One, the supply side, so that of the side of the transportation planners and governing bodies, so those making the decisions. And two, from the demand side, which is the perspective of users of transit in cities. So first, a quick overview of what we mean by the supply and demand side of transportation. On the supply side, we have capacity, frequency, and coverage. Supply is essentially the infrastructure that's available that enables transportation to happen. So it can be in terms of capacity, so roads, rails, services, so that includes the frequency and the routes, constitutes networks and coverage. And on the demand side, we have the movement of people and goods in order to satisfy needs. This is essentially just people that need to move around, people and goods that have to move. This is the demand side. All right, so it may not be a surprise to you that most transit systems are designed using information and data that rarely includes specific perspectives of the users or specific perspectives of the different types of people and social identities of those who are making the demand, the travel demand. So there's not a lot of female-specific perspectives or sort of ethnocentric perspectives, any other sort of variety of social identities and categorizations. The data doesn't usually capture that. So the reading that you had for this week that focused on sort of the experience and understanding gender and translink is an example of the type of data gathering and research that's being done to try and include those perspectives. So from what exists, there are fairly robust ways of kind of understanding environmental and economic aspects, but social indicators that would inform the development of policy and transportation plans in a way that was, I don't want to say sensitive, but in a way that's reflective of the diverse social categorizations of individuals that are going to be using the transportation. That should really be a core focus of sort of advancing transportation planning today. So safe and reliable access to public transport is really a key driver of a lot of issues that we're facing today. There's a lot of movement towards making cities inclusive and equity-based policies that are centered upon equity. But until we bring in these perspectives or determine ways to bring in these perspectives to how transportations make plans for, route frequencies, where stops are, it shouldn't just be based on the flow of traffic or sort of, traffic counts and indicators. It shouldn't just be based around, when is the busiest time going to be around those typical hours between 9 to 5, when rush hours are. It's time to really expand beyond that and find ways to make changes to transportation supply so that it does become more inclusive to those who are using it. And those policy decisions really ought to be based on this intersectional understanding or this intersectional approach to transportation demand. So understanding really who the users are, how they're experiencing public transportation or transit in a city, and making decisions and changes to the transportation supply in order to better meet the needs of those individuals and the intersections of social identity and categorizations where they sit. So the supply side of urban transportation, again, involves what transportation forms, networks, and infrastructure are supplied by public authorities. So it's what is there from those who are supplying the transportation to be used by those demanding the transportation. So again, we see the relationship here. Any sort of basic understanding of economics, supply and demand are separate categories, but obviously this is very relational. And the idea is that, as the demand goes up, the supply must also go up to meet that demand. And this is sort of one of the basic premises of economic relationships. So a great example of how bringing an intersectional lens to the supply side of transportation in cities came to me through this book, Invisible Women, and also the podcast 99% Invisible had a fantastic episode that looked at the case studies covered in this book. So it was written by a journalist, and one of the case studies that she undertook was looking at, I know it sounds boring at first, but bear with me, the snow clearing patterns in a small town in Sweden. And a lot of cities have the same approach to the supply side of transportation and infrastructure when it comes to clearing snow, and that it takes what is ostensibly a neutral approach to understanding, what's the best, most efficient, and safest way to go about clearing snow. How do you prioritize roads and infrastructure, etc.? And the approach used by most cities is that you clear the arterials first because it's important, and the most people is the assumption. The most people will be needing to travel to and from work safely. So usually the plan in place when there is large snowfalls is to do those main travel arteries, arterial roads first. But this town in Sweden decided to take a slightly different approach, and they went into, actually researchers did it first and then presented the data to the city, and they changed their policy accordingly. What they found is that male and female driving patterns were really different, and by designing this approach to snow clearing around arterials and people going to work, it really ended up privileging men over women. Women were more likely to be using side streets and sidewalks because they were the ones to be found doing most of the errand running, to be dropping children off and picking up from school. They usually had children with them. They were more likely to travel to care for elderly family members. And they also did more of this on foot or by taking public transportation. So when they looked at this data, they decided to take a different approach. The town decided to take a different approach to clearing the snow. And what they did is, instead of clearing the main arteries first, they decided to prioritize side streets and sidewalks. And the best part of this case study is not only was it more efficient, it ended up being safer. So there was lower healthcare costs, much fewer trips to the emergency room. And yeah, it ended up being not only more efficient, but also saving money and having better health outcomes. So by not sort of subsuming this idea of the prioritization of workers through a unidimensional lens, by separating out who those workers are, and also what other tasks or things that the citizens were doing, it ended up being a much more equal and equality-based decision to choose to shift snow clearing patterns to prioritize side streets and sidewalks over main arterials. And so this is just one way that, approaching the supply side of transportation in urban centers could benefit from applying an intersectional lens. And the intersectional lens here is not just seeing workers as workers, but understanding sort of the gendered nature of work, the gendered nature of caretaking, And also subsumed in that, obviously, this being in a smaller city in Sweden, there wasn't a ton of diversity in terms of racial makeup or ethnicity, etc. But we can see how when you continue to add on these different ways of socially constructing and socially categorizing citizens in a city, those making decisions are much more able to sort of make not only better, more efficient decisions, but also make travel and moving through cities much more equitable. To understand the importance of bringing an intersectional lens to transportation demand, we need look no further than the increasingly rampant but also deplorable experiences of racialized people taking public transportation, who have to take public transportation during this global pandemic. So unfortunately, there's been plenty of reports and a sharp spike in xenophobia being exercised and exhibited on public transportation particularly. And looking at this, we understand from the demand side, so from the experience of users of public transportation, the experience of being on public transportation and the different risks that individuals must assume depending on the intersections of their social categorizations and how they identify, especially how they are socially categorized outwardly by others taking public transportation, presents a highly problematic and complex set of circumstances that individuals have to enter into in order to get to and from the places that they need to go. So this is just one example, I think a really poignant example right now of how understanding that people using public transportation can't be just subsumed into one category of transportation users or commuters. And we have to understand that people bring a wide variety of identities with them in the places that they go, and that the way that those social categorizations and identities are observed by others and how others react to those social categorizations can potentially bring about a highly problematic and dangerous and definitely oppressive set of circumstances for those who are trying to access public transportation, who need to access public transportation. Other examples of this can be found in the report that you had to read for this week by Tahia Ahmed, who unfortunately was unable to join us. That report provides a lot of other excellent examples of how those using public transportation in urban centers experience different sets of circumstances or have a different way of using and understanding and having to navigate public transportation, depending on, again, on that intersection of social categorizations that they have. So I'll end this virtual lecture with some questions to think about for the next time that you're in your discussion groups. The first question is, in what ways do this week's two readings demonstrate an intersectional and mobilities-based conceptualization of public transit? So asking you to take these two new key terms of intersectionality and mobilities and think about how they apply to the readings. You also want to be thinking about the big question that was organizing all the content for this lecture. And that is, what is the relevance of intersectional dynamics in urban transportation? And particularly, the thing to think about here is, how does an intersectional lens help us understand uneven mobilities in urban transportation? So I'll leave you with this. Obviously, this lecture recorded is a lot shorter than it would have been in person. In lecture, you would have been given a break. You would have been given opportunities to discuss and think through some of the things as we were moving through with those around you. But I hope you took time to take some breaks for yourself, and thanks for bearing with me as I think about and figure out how to sort of translate this in-class experience this shared social experience that we have in lecture with, all the privileges of eye contact, and different ways of engaging you. Yeah, so just thanks for bearing with me as I figure out how to best translate that experience in person to this online format. Thank you and take care.